What's going on, everyone? I'm back, and today I wanted to talk my top 5 offenses to avoid this fantasy football season. Now, I think we all know the top offenses that we would like to go ahead and get some players from. You know, the Patriots come to mind, the Steelers, the Packers, the Saints. But I do think the other side of the fence here is a little bit more interesting. Now, I'm going to break this down in terms of total points put together from that offense. I guess in this case it would be the least amount of points put together from this offensive group. And I don't think this is going to necessarily be a team that has just a lack of playmakers, but also take into account the system they have there. So without further ado, let's get right into it. Kicking off all of this, in the first team that I want to mention is the Buffalo Bills. And when talking Buffalo, I think you have to start with the quarterback situation, which is comprised of A.J. McCarron, Peterman, and Josh Allen. And starting with A.J. McCarron, first and foremost, I'd like to get some clarity on what the heck is going on with his collarbone injury. Is it an actual injury? Because one week it sounds like it's broken. The other week, it sounds like there's not a real issue. To me, it sounds like the Bills can't make up their mind and just are looking for any reason not to have to play McCarron at the start of the year. And honestly, I can't blame them because while in Cincinnati, A.J. McCarron showed us nothing in terms of reasons why he could be a starting quarterback. Then looking at Peterman, well, what did he show us last year in his one start? Oh, that's right. You know, he had about 5 interceptions and then got yanked. And then that leaves us Josh Allen. And honestly, I'm not a big fan of Josh Allen, but I still think he's the best quarterback the Bills have. I wasn't a big fan of him coming out of college. I think the reason a lot of people were so high on him was because he reminded people of Carson Wentz, or at least he fit the mold of Carson Wentz the most. You know, that smaller college quarterback, not as well known, but still has that high ceiling, high potential. And unfortunately for him, he doesn't have that many weapons around him. Looking at probably the biggest name on that offense with LeSean McCoy, I do think he's probably the most talented guy there, but there's too many issues with LeSean McCoy. First and foremost, there's off-the-field issues that we don't know how they're going to play out. Is he going to get suspended? Is he not going to get suspended? What's going to happen? It's really hard to say. On top of all this, I do think that LeSean McCoy has an injury history. He can't quite stay 100% healthy during the season. And now there's reports coming out about him dealing with a groin injury. So, you know, that is definitely not comforting. And a third point is, you know, he is on the wrong side of 30. And we all know what happens when an NFL running back gets to the age of 30. They decline, and they decline fast. Now, I did say he's the biggest name offensively for the Bills, but I don't think that's going to do much good considering other teams can go ahead and load the box on the Bills, and I think that's going to take away a lot of what LeSean McCoy is going to be able to do. Now, if you were looking for a silver lining with the passing game, I don't think you're going to be able to get one because the number one wide receiver for the Bills is Kelvin Benjamin, who is only being discussed right now is because he can't stop talking about how much he hates Cam Newton and how he was an awful fit in Carolina. Well, the fact of the matter is, unfortunately, Kelvin Benjamin is a guy that recently can't stay healthy, recently has had some weight issues, and can't exactly stretch the field, which I think is something important for a rookie wide receiver to have. He's more of that bigger body physical guy. I will say, at this point, I think the best wide receiver the Bills have is Corey Coleman, who they just got from the Browns. They do have Charles Clay, who honestly I think might be the best pass catcher for the Bills. But after that, there's not too much depth in my opinion. And I talked about the most points being put together by these offenses. I think that's going to be one of the biggest deciding factor in what offenses to avoid. And honestly, I think with the Bills, that group of guys they have, they might put together one of the lowest offensive totals. Honestly, if I had to pick right now, I would say they probably finished the season as the worst team in football. They're my favorite to go ahead and pick first this year, and that's a big reason why I'm going to go ahead and avoid the Bills like the plague this year. Continuing on next with the Baltimore Ravens, this is a team that's been somewhat relevant as of late, mainly because of what they can do defensively, not offensively. And maybe you say it starts with the quarterback because ever since Flacco went on that Super Bowl run and got paid, he hasn't exactly been the most elite quarterback. But I don't think it's going to help the fact that all these pass catchers that the Ravens have this year are pretty much new to the team with no former experience with Baltimore. You've got Michael Crabtree, who I think is in the tail end of his career. You've got John Brown, who, some nice buzz is coming out about him from camp, but after that one pretty good year in Arizona, he hasn't quite been able to duplicate it. And then you've got Willie Snead, who, coming from the Saints, had some issues with suspensions last year. A lot of people were high on him, but then he wasn't really able to get back on the field. Then you've also got Hayden Hurst, the rookie tight end, who we don't really know what to expect from. And if I had to be honest, man, I don't think any of these guys are wide receiver number one quality for the Ravens. Heck, in fantasy, I wouldn't feel comfortable as having any of them wide receiver twos, probably flex at most. Now, when it comes to the running game, a lot of people are really high on Alex Collins this year. I'm not one of them. This was a guy that at certain points last year got beat out by, Javorius Allen, Dixon. So I don't think that's necessarily a good thing. If you were a top-notch running back, which some people think he can be a high-end running back too, I don't think you would have found yourself in those situations. That touchdown potential is going to be hard to duplicate as well. And honestly, when it's all said and done, I wouldn't be surprised if the Ravens are one of the worst teams that are in their division, because we all know that the Steelers are going to be the best team in that division. Look, the Browns, as silly as it sounds, they've added a lot of talent on that team in general. And then the Bengals, if they can just put it together offensively, I think we all know they have plenty of playmakers, starting with A.J. Green, to go ahead and make something happen. So when you consider all of that, I think that spells another offensively troubled year for the Ravens in 2018. And personally, I'm not touching their wide receivers or their running backs this season. Moving on, I've got the Tampa Bay Buccaneers next, and with the Bucs, this was an offense that I wasn't really that high on going into 2018. And then a couple of things happened that made me even more skeptical. Obviously, first is the Jameis Winston suspension. And, maybe you thought you were going to go ahead, be sneaky, get Jameis Winston in the late rounds. He did have some promising starts last year, but then that suspension hit, and now he's probably going undrafted. You're also a little bit worried probably about his injury history, which is understandable. Now, the Bucs do have Ryan Fitzpatrick, who can be all over the place, so don't necessarily rely on that too much. They obviously have a big name wide receiver here, so maybe you can go ahead, put an asterisk next to this, because Mike Evans, no doubt is a quality wide receiver. But looking at last year, man, he barely got over 1,000 yards. I believe he had like 1,002 yards exactly, or something like that. And he had only one game of 100+ yards. To me, that's concerning because Mike Evans hasn't exactly been the most consistent guy. And I do think he's going to go ahead and take a hit now that Jameis Winston isn't there, no matter if Ryan Fitzpatrick is a good backup. And unfortunately, after Mike Evans, I don't think that Deshaun Jackson really has much left in the tank. He's always been that just blow the top off of your defense kind of guy, and I don't think that's a reliable option to have. Those are kind of guys that I usually avoid in fantasy. Their production is just so hard to predict, and as much as I like Mike Evans, it's no coincidence that this year he was going towards the end of the second round. Obviously some recency bias, but he did put up over 1,000 yards. And now with the suspension going even later in the second round. Then I will say the Bucs do have some somewhat promising talent at the tight end position with O.J. Howard and Brate. But the fact that both of them are there splits the production that either one of them can have. And then the most interesting situation here is the running back situation, because you've got Peyton Barber, Ronald Jones, Jacquizz Rodgers. So much hype was put on Ronald Jones. I'm sure everyone has heard from a lot of different people how high they should be on Ronald Jones. From the get-go, this was a guy that I was avoiding and a guy that I wasn't confident in, not just because the Bucs worry me offensively, but because honestly, I don't have that much faith in that Tampa Bay running game in general. If you ask me, I think the best running back on that team is Jacquizz Rodgers because of what he can do in the passing game as well. Now, all reports coming out of preseason and camp is that Peyton Barber is going to be the main guy. So, if there's going to be a guy that you take a late flyer on, it should definitely be Peyton Barber. And I would say not Ronald Jones, even though the Bucs went ahead, invested an early round pick in him in the draft. I just think there's too many question marks with that running back situation. And maybe Peyton Barber does start out as the main guy, but then when Ronald Jones starts to figure things out, that's going to go ahead and interfere with that situation and become something like a committee. But definitely what we've seen from Ronald Jones in this preseason, I would say should have you worried. And all things considered, again, I think the Tampa Bay Bucs probably have the worst offense in the NFC South. And there's some pretty good defenses in the NFC South. And that means for 6 games out of the year, the Bucs aren't going to have the exactly easiest task ahead of them. And that's just one of the reasons out of the ones that I've listed where I'm avoiding the Tampa Bay players this year. Next, I've got the Tennessee Titans. And with the Titans, I think this is an interesting case because I don't think they're going to be that bad of a team overall. But offensively, especially fantasy-wise, I don't think this is a friendly offense to go ahead and pick players from. And starting with the running backs, because I do think this is going to be a run-first team. Going kind of through the timeline of emotions with that situation, DeMarco Murray is released, and then a lot of fantasy players were jumping for joy because they finally knew Derrick Henry was going to get his chance. Well, that didn't last long because the Titans went ahead, added Dion Lewis, and all reports from Tennessee is that it's going to be a true 1A, 1B situation. And as much as I might like Derrick Henry or Dion Lewis by himself, when you pair that up, that takes away so much potential. It pretty much cuts their potential in half. And unless there's an injury, which you can't plan, I'm not going to be able to go ahead and trust either of those guys as my running back number 1. Forget about that. Even as my running back number 2, it's tough to go ahead and grab a non-elite running back talent that's going to have to split carries and trust them as a running back number 2. Maybe as a flex guy, maybe in a PPR league, you feel a little bit more comfortable with Dion Lewis. But otherwise, I'm going to go ahead and avoid both those guys, to be frank with you, especially considering Derrick Henry is going like at the end of the 3rd round, early 4th round, which I think isn't justified for what kind of value he really presents. Then you have Marcus Mariota, who I do think a lot of people are high on that he's going to bounce back, new offensive system. Things are really going to go his way, but I always have thought that Mariota's, again, more of a run-first quarterback, not exactly the most accurate guy. He struggled with injuries again, and the wide receivers he has, well, I don't think, again, it's a situation that should get a lot of people excited. There's Corey Davis, who had about 400 yards his rookie year. Obviously, he went through some injuries himself. Then you have Delaney Walker, who I think is the best pass catcher the Titans have, and the guy that Mariota feels most comfortable with, but unfortunately, he's getting older and older and older, and he's only going to be able to do what he can for so long. And considering all of that, again, I think the Titans are a team where they don't have a true wide receiver number 1 on their roster. I think they have 2 really good running backs individually, but when you put them together, they both become like low-end running backs number 2. So as much as I do think the Titans are actually going to have a decent year, all those factors coupled together are going to make me avoid all of those offensive players on Tennessee. The 5th and final team on my list is the Chicago Bears, and if you've listened to some of my player rankings going into the season, you know that I'm not a fan of the Bears offensively this year, and it's got nothing to do with the playmakers they added, but everything to do with the quarterback they have. Now, addressing the playmakers they have, I think on paper, they're pretty good. Allen Robinson, even though I'm scared with him coming off of an ACL injury and having pretty much just one good year with the Jaguars, I still think he's a decent wide receiver. I still think he was the best wide receiver in free agency. Taylor Gabriel, a low-key guy that I think can be good. Trey Burton, he got overpaid, if you ask me, but that just means he's going to get used. I think Anthony Miller is a guy that I really liked coming out of college. But then when you throw Mitchell Trubisky into that, it makes me not like those guys that much because, look, trust me, I watch a lot of the Bears every single week in the season. The Bears and Mitchell Trubisky, I don't think that's going to has a long-term future there. To me, Trubisky is not a franchise quarterback. Admittedly so, the Bears overpaid to go ahead and get him. They overvalued him. He was a guy that had one decent year in North Carolina, didn't face the best talent there, and when he went ahead and started last year after Mike Glennon was god-awful, he put up 7 touchdowns in the games that he played, which isn't good. And if you look at his yardage, that's even worse. Now, this preseason, he hasn't exactly done anything to stand out. And honestly, this is the way that I think about it. Think of all the NFL quarterbacks in the NFL, then think of how many of those quarterbacks you think are worse than Mitchell Trubisky, not including the rookies that came in this year. Honestly, I can't think of that many that I would rather take Mitchell Trubisky over them because honestly, I think he's a bottom tier quarterback in the NFL. He's somewhat athletic, which helps the situation out, but I don't think he's ever going to be a guy that throws consistently for 300 yards and like 3 or 4 touchdowns. I think he's by far the worst quarterback in the NFC North. And the one player that I do like in that offense is Jordan Howard. I see some potential there. So, feel free to put an asterisk next to this last edition of the Bears on this list. But you know why I like Jordan Howard so much? It's because he's pretty much independent of anything tied to Mitchell Trubisky, because his performance is independent of how bad or good Mitchell Trubisky is. And to me, that's the most telling thing out there for the Bears this season. It's just not something I can get on board with considering who the quarterback of the Bears is, and that's that. So with that, we come to an end of this list and my take on the top offenses to avoid this year. And I'm sure there's not going to be 100% agreement on this, so let me hear it in the comments section. Are there teams that I should have added? Are there teams that I should have absolutely had no business including on this list? If you think so, go ahead, try and convince me otherwise. I don't know if you're going to be successful, but it'll be a fun conversation regardless. And as always, make sure to go ahead, like, subscribe if you guys enjoyed, and I'll see you guys in future videos.